Welcome, my dear friends. If you like the video, please comment below and hit that like button. For more exciting and informative videos, subscribe and ring the bell for updates. Your support truly helps us grow and reach more people. Thank you. Let's dive in. You ever been truly alone? Not just physically isolated, but existentially adrift. That's where I was, drifting, when Hemlock Creek found me, or maybe when I found it. Either way, it wasn't a rescue, not in the way I'd hoped. It was more like a siren's call, beautiful and deadly, promising solace but delivering something far, far different. My name's Ethan, and until a few months back I had a life. Job as a project manager, decent apartment, the hum of the city a constant, if unnoticed, companion. Then the company downsized, corporate euphemism for you're redundant. Thanks for your years of service, here's a severance package that won't last. And suddenly the hum stopped. Silence descended and it was deafening. Everyone told me, take a break, Ethan, you deserve it. Get out in nature, clear your head. Sounded like a plan. I'd always been a camper, nothing extreme, just weekend jaunts, grilling burgers, cracking open a beer under the stars. This time, though, I wanted deeper solitude. I wanted to lose myself in the green, to let the trees absorb the concrete and steel that had become my life, to maybe, just maybe, hear my own thoughts again over the static of my anxieties. Hemlock Creek, the name sounded peaceful, a place where hemlocks whispered secrets to the wind, where water chuckled over stones. The online descriptions painted a picture of remote tranquility, a hidden gem in the vast national forest. Perfect. I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and pointed myself towards the wilderness, chasing that phantom of peace. The drive was long, the asphalt ribbon unspooling as the city receded in my rearview mirror. The landscape shifted, buildings thinning out to be replaced by rolling hills, then dense woods, the air growing cooler, crisper. By the time I reached the turnoff for Hemlock Creek Road, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. Hemlock Creek Road was less a road, more a suggestion of one. Gravel and dirt, barely wider than my truck, winding deeper and deeper into the pines. They were everywhere, those pines, towering giants, their needles a dark, almost black-green, so thick they blotted out most of the remaining sunlight. The air grew heavy, still, and the silence was the first thing that truly unsettled me. It wasn't the silence of nature, the peaceful quiet of a sleeping forest. This was a silence that felt expectant, like the woods were holding its breath, waiting for something. I found the designated camping area, a small clearing barely big enough for a few tents, marked by a weathered wooden sign that read, Hemlock Creek Primitive Campsite Permit Required beyond this point. No other vehicles, no signs of recent campers. Just me, the pines, and that oppressive silence. Setting up camp was a mechanical process, muscle memory taking over as I pitched my tent, unpacked my gear, and gathered firewood. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction, a temporary balm for the persistent ache of, well, everything. But even as I moved through the motions, that silence gnawed at me. It was broken only by the rustle of my own movements, the snap of twigs under my boots, the metallic clang of my camping stove. And then the whispers began. At first they were so faint, so ephemeral, I almost dismissed them as my imagination. A trick of the wind through the pine needles, maybe, or the blood rushing in my ears. Just whispers on the wind, barely audible, indistinct murmurs that seemed to brush against the edge of my hearing. I was tired, stressed, alone in the woods. Of course my mind was playing tricks. I busied myself with starting a fire, the crackling flames a small point of warmth and light in the encroaching twilight. As the fire grew, pushing back the shadows, the whispers seemed to fade. Or maybe I was just getting used to them, tuning them out like background noise. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest talking. the wind carrying secrets through the whispering pines. But then things started to shift, subtle things at first easily explained away. My water bottle, which I was sure I'd left by the fire, was suddenly beside my tent. My compass, carefully placed on the picnic table, was under my sleeping bag. Small things, easily dismissed as fatigue, inattention. The forgetfulness of a man whose mind was still reeling from the shock of unemployment and the ghost of a failed marriage. But then came the unsettling animal behavior. The squirrels, usually bold and inquisitive, vanished completely. The birds, which had been chirping and calling earlier, fell silent. Even the insects seemed to have retreated, leaving an unnerving stillness hanging in the air. And the feeling of being watched, that was constant, growing stronger with each passing hour. It wasn't a visual thing, not at first. No shadowy figures lurking in the trees, no eyes glinting in the darkness. Just a sense, a prickling on the back of my neck, a feeling of unseen presence, like something was observing me, studying me from just beyond the reach of my senses. That night the whispers intensified. No longer faint murmurs on the wind, they became more distinct, more directed. They seemed to weave through the rustling pine needles, carried on the night air, almost like voices, but distorted, twisted, just beyond the edge of comprehension. I lay in my tent, wide awake, listening, the hairs on my arms standing on end. They started softly, just indistinct sounds, then coalesced, formed, became something else. Whispers in the wind, yes, but whispers that seemed to know me. Whispers that seemed to call my name. Ethan, it was barely audible, a breath of sound, but it was there, woven into the sighing of the pines. My name whispered on the wind. I told myself it was my imagination, stress, the isolation getting to me. But the whispers continued, growing stronger, more insistent. Ethan, alone. The words were fragmented, disjointed, but they were there. And they weren't just calling my name. They were speaking to me, about my solitude, my vulnerability, my fears. Ethan, lost, afraid. They knew. They knew my anxieties, my deepest insecurities, the raw nerve endings of my broken life. It was more than unsettling, it was invasive, violating. It felt like my thoughts were being plucked from my mind, amplified, and thrown back at me by the whispering pines. Sleep became impossible. I lay in my tent, rigid with fear, every rustle, every sigh of the wind, every whisper, a fresh jolt of terror. The whispers became my constant companions, a malevolent chorus that echoed the emptiness inside me, amplifying my loneliness, feeding my fear. The next morning I decided to hike further, hoping to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the campsite, to find some rational explanation for the whispers, to prove to myself it was all in my head. I followed a game trail deeper into the woods, away from the creek, deeper into the pines. It was then I found the carvings. On the trunks of the older pines, hidden amongst the moss and lichen, were markings. Not random scratches, not animal claw marks, but deliberate carvings, symbols etched into the bark. They were old, weathered, almost obscured by time, but they were there. Circles, spirals, jagged lines, shapes that seemed to writhe and shift even as I looked at them. They were disturbing, unsettling, but strangely familiar. And then it hit me. The whispers, the carvings, they were connected. The symbols resonated with the whispers, echoed their unsettling cadence, their malevolent intent. I traced one of the carvings with my finger, the rough bark scratching against my skin. As I touched it, the whispers intensified, becoming a chorus, a cacophony of voices that seemed to vibrate through the ground, through the trees, through me. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and I stumbled back, reeling from a sudden wave of nausea. That's when I knew this wasn't my imagination, this wasn't stress. Something was happening here, something real, something terrifying, and the whispers, they weren't just in the wind. They were coming from the pines themselves. Panic seized me. I had to get out of Hemlock Creek. I had to get back to my truck, back to civilization, back to... anywhere but here. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, desperate to escape the whispering pines, the disturbing carvings, the oppressive silence. Back at the campsite, I fumbled with my keys, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had to leave now, but as I turned the ignition, nothing. Silence. The engine wouldn't even turn over. I tried again and again, the same dead silence mocking my frantic attempts to escape. My truck, my lifeline, my escape route was dead, trapped, just me and the whispering pines of Hemlock Creek, and they were getting louder. The whispers became a cacophony, a swirling vortex of sound that seemed to surround me, to penetrate me. No longer faint murmurs on the wind, they were voices now, distinct, malevolent, a chorus of unseen entities speaking in unison, yet each voice somehow separate, distinct, targeting me individually. Ethan can't escape, nowhere to run, we know you, all your fears, embrace the silence, become one of us. The pines themselves were whispering. I realized it with a chilling certainty that went beyond logic, beyond reason. The trees weren't just trees. They were conduits, vessels for something ancient, something malevolent, something that had been waiting, watching, listening for someone like me to wander into its domain. The forest closed in. It wasn't just a feeling, it was real. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches reaching, grasping, the pine needles rustling with a sound that was no longer just the wind. The whispers intensified, becoming physical, tangible. I felt them on my skin, cold, clammy, like spectral fingers tracing my face, my arms, my neck. Branches whipped at me not randomly, but with intent like weapons. Pine needles, sharp and stinging, flew through the air, hitting my face, my eyes, drawing blood. The forest was attacking me. The whispers were its weapons, the pines its soldiers. Claustrophobia gripped me, a suffocating wave of panic. The clearing, which had seemed so open, so welcoming, was now a cage, the trees its bars, the whispers its jailers. I had to fight back, to do something, anything, to break free from this nightmare. Fire was the answer. Fire was light, warmth, defiance against the encroaching darkness. Fire was life in the heart of this dying, whispering forest. I scrambled for my fire starter, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Gathering every piece of dry wood I could find, I piled it into the fire pit, ignoring the stinging needles, the whipping branches, the relentless whispers that grew louder, more frantic, with every movement I made. Sparks flew, then a flicker of flame, then a rush of fire, licking at the dry wood, growing, expanding, pushing back the darkness. The whispers momentarily receding, weakened by the sudden burst of light and heat. With the fire blazing, a defiant beacon in the whispering pines, I turned to my truck. My tools. I remembered my tools buried in the back under layers of camping gear. Desperate, frantic, I rummaged through the truck bed, ignoring the whispers that still circled me, drawn to the fire but held back by its power. A wrench, a screwdriver, a spark plug wrench. Enough to try, enough to hope. Working by the flickering firelight, my hands numb with cold and fear, I started to work on the engine. I didn't know what was wrong, didn't have the expertise to diagnose the problem, but I had to try. Anything was better than just waiting, just listening to the whispers, just letting the forest consume me. Hours blurred together in a frantic dance of fear and desperation. The fire roared, pushing back the darkness, the whispers momentarily silenced or at least muffled by the crackling flames. I worked on the engine, blindly, instinctively, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate will to survive. And then a miracle. A cough, a sputter, then the rumble of the engine turning over, catching, roaring to life. Tears streamed down my face, a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I slammed the hood shut, scrambled into the driver's seat, and threw the truck into gear, not even bothering to pack up my camp, leaving everything behind, offering it as a sacrifice to the whispering pines if that's what it took to escape. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting gravel, headlights cutting through the fog and smoke. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just drove faster and faster away from the fire, away from the campsite, away from Hemlock Creek, away from the whispering pines. I drove through the night, not stopping until the sun rose, painting the sky in colors that felt impossibly vibrant, impossibly normal after the monochrome nightmare I'd just escaped. I was miles away from Hemlock Creek, back on paved roads, back in a world that felt real. But Hemlock Creek is still with me, in the silence that sometimes descends even in the city, in the rustling of trees even in the park downtown, in the whispers on the wind that sometimes, just sometimes, sound like they're calling my name. I escaped Hemlock Creek physically, but a part of me, a dark, fearful, haunted part, is still there, trapped in the whispering pines, forever listening to the voices on the wind, forever waiting for the silence to return. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear them. The whispers, calling my name, inviting me back, promising solace in the silence, in the heart of the whispering pines of Hemlock Creek. And the fear, cold and clammy, grips me anew, a reminder that some escapes are never truly complete, some horrors never truly left behind. They say Shadow Mountain got its name because even on the brightest summer day, twilight clings to its slopes like a shroud. I didn't believe it, not really, until I saw it for myself. Ranger Station 7, perched high on the mountain's flank, was my first solo assignment, my chance to prove I wasn't just some fresh-faced kid playing dress-up in a ranger uniform. Deputy Ranger Ben Carter, reporting for duty. Sounded good in my head anyway. The drive up was beautiful, all winding roads and towering pines that clawed at the sky, but as I climbed higher, a palpable shift occurred. The sunlight, so cheerful down in the valley, grew thin, filtered, almost hesitant to penetrate the dense canopy above. By the time I pulled into the gravel clearing that served as Station 7's parking area, a perpetual dusk seemed to have settled. Shadow Mountain lived up to its name, all right. Station 7 was rustic. Dilapidated was probably closer to the truth. A single-story log cabin, weathered gray, with a porch that sagged like a weary old man's shoulders. Paint peeled from the window frames, and the roof looked like it had seen better decades. But it was solid, or solid enough, and it was mine for the night. Just me, the trees, and the shadows. Old Man Hemlock, the ranger who'd briefed me back at dispatch, had chuckled when he handed over the keys. Station 7, huh? You hear the stories about that place, Deputy Carter? I'd shrugged it off, a cocky grin plastered on my face. Folklore, right? Haunted ranger station, spooky woods, the usual. Hemlock's eyes, though, had held a flicker of something unreadable. Folklore's got roots, son. Just keep your wits about you, and maybe leave a light on. Easy for him to say, back in his warm office, surrounded by fluorescent lights and the comforting hum of the radio. Here at Station 7, the silence was thick, pressing. As I unlocked the creaking door and stepped inside, the air was instantly colder, heavier. It smelled of damp wood and dust, a smell that spoke of disuse, of neglect. The main room was sparsely furnished. A heavy wooden desk, scarred and stained, a couple of rickety chairs, and a CB radio that looked older than me. A kerosene lamp sat on the desk, its glass chimney clouded with grime. I lit it, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe in the corners of the room. Shadows within shadows. Clever Shadow Mountain. I ran through my checklist, more for something to do than actual necessity. Radio check, static, just static. Flashlight, beam weak, batteries probably ancient. First aid kit looked like it hadn't been opened since the Nixon administration. Everything was aged, tired like the station itself. Outside, the twilight deepened into true night. The forest, so seemingly benign in the fading light, now pressed in, a black wall around the small circle of the station. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, the quiet, city boy nerves. But even as I told myself that, a prickle of unease ran down my spine, a sensation that had nothing to do with logic or reason. It started subtly, a rustling in the leaves just beyond the porch. Animal, I told myself, deer, raccoon, something harmless. But then it came again, closer this time, heavier, not rustling, but padding. Like something big, too big for a deer, moving with deliberate steps just outside the circle of lamplight. I grabbed the flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the gloom. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too fragile in the oppressive silence. "Park ranger here, anyone out there?" Silence, just the wind sighing through the pines, or what sounded like wind. Maybe it was just the wind, but then came the growl. It wasn't a bear growl, not the deep rumble I'd heard during training exercises. This was higher pitched, sharper, laced with a guttural edge that sent a shiver of pure ice down my spine. Animalistic, yes, but wrong, distorted, like something trying to imitate a growl but missing the mark. The growl faded, replaced by whispers, faint, indistinct, carried on the wind or not the wind. The air was still heavy. The whispers seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves, from the very darkness that clung to the edges of the clearing. I retreated inside, bolting the heavy wooden door. Ridiculous, I knew, bolting a door against shadows, but the primal instinct to seek shelter, to barricade myself in, was overwhelming. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls, mocking my fear. Inside, the malfunction started. The radio, which had been stubbornly silent, crackled to life, spewing a torrent of static. Not the normal white noise static, but a pulsing, rhythmic static like a heartbeat gone mad. I fiddled with the knobs, trying to tune it, to get a clear signal, any signal, but it was no use. Just that maddening, rhythmic pulse. Then the lights. The station was wired for generator power, a small, ancient thing housed in a shed behind the cabin. The lights had been dimmed to begin with, but now they started to flicker, erratically, plunging the room into near darkness, then surging back to a weak, anemic glow. Flicker, 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 like a dying candle, like a heartbeat slowing, faltering. And the cold. It wasn't just the night chill seeping in through the cracks in the walls. This was a deeper cold, an unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from within the station itself. It seeped into my bones, numbing my fingers, raising goose flesh on my arms despite the summer night. Shadows inside now. I saw them from the corner of my eye, shifting, moving when they shouldn't. The shadows cast by the lamp, by the furniture, stretching, contorting, taking on shapes that weren't quite right. Longer, thinner, sharper-edged. Humanoid almost, but wrong. Doors creaking. The cabin door, bolted shut, groaned, the heavy wood protesting as if something was pressing against it from the outside. Then the interior doors, the ones leading to the small back rooms, started to creak open, slowly, silently. The office door, the storage room door, the bathroom door, each one yawning open into deeper darkness. Objects displaced. A pen rolled off the desk, not falling but sliding deliberately across the surface, stopping at the very edge, teetering precariously. A stack of Ranger manuals shifted on a shelf, toppling to the floor with a soft thud. Small things, insignificant things, but each one a tiny pinprick of fear, a slow erosion of my sanity. The radio, the static suddenly clearing, blared to life again. Not static this time, but voices. Garbled, distorted, overlapping, but voices nonetheless. Dispatch, maybe. Finally, contact. "Station 7, this is dispatch. Do you read?" The voice was fragmented, broken, barely intelligible through the interference. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Carter at Station 7, reading you. Barely. Repeat message, please." My voice trembled despite my best efforts to keep it steady. More static than another voice, different this time, lower, raspier. "Get out. Station. Not safe." The voice broke, choked, as if cut off mid-sentence. "Dispatch, repeat, please. What's going on? Dispatch, do you read?" I gripped the microphone, knuckles white, my voice rising in panic. Static again, then a third voice, high-pitched, almost childlike, but laced with a chilling undercurrent of malice. "Help! Me! Please! It hurts!" The voice dissolved into a sob, then silence. And then the whispers again, no longer indistinct, no longer carried on the wind. They were inside the station now, inside my head, it seemed. Soft, sibilant, just at the edge of hearing, but words nonetheless. Words I couldn't quite grasp, but that resonated with a deep, primal fear. Words that spoke of darkness, of waiting, of hunger. Distorted figures in the periphery. Glimpses only, fleeting shadows that danced at the edge of my vision. A flash of movement by the window, something tall, too tall and impossibly thin. A shape in the corner of the room, hunched and animalistic, its eyes glinting in the dim light. Shadows that stretched and contorted, taking on unnatural forms, mocking the familiar shapes of the furniture, the walls, the very station itself. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing in on me like the walls themselves were closing in. The whispers intensified, swirling around me, a chorus of voices just beyond my grasp, just beyond understanding, but all speaking of the same thing: fear. Then the station breached. Not a door kicked in, not a window shattered. Something shifted. The very air seemed to thin, to tear, and a cold draft, colder than anything natural, swept through the room. The kerosene lamp sputtered, the flame shrinking to a tiny point of light before winking out, plunging the station into absolute darkness. But it wasn't true darkness. In the void where the lamp had been, something formed, slowly, agonizingly slowly, shapes coalesced from the shadows. Tendrils of darkness writhing, reaching like ink bleeding into water. They twisted, elongated, taking on form, but form that refused to be fixed, constantly shifting, flowing. Then the animalistic shapes, monstrous, distorted versions of creatures I knew, twisted into something nightmarish. A wolf, but too large, too gaunt, its fur replaced by something that looked like tangled thorns. A bear, but its limbs were too long, its claws too sharp, its head too small for its body, ending in a snout filled with needle-like teeth. And the voice, it spoke not from the shadowy forms, but from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating in my bones, vibrating in my skull. It mimicked a voice I knew, a voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice that brought with it a wave of guilt so intense it almost buckled my knees. "Benny," my brother's voice, soft, hesitant, just like he used to say it. "Mike, gone now, 2 years gone, cancer eating him alive, and me? I've been here at Station 7 watching over the park," I'd told myself, scared to face it, scared to face him. "Benny, why didn't you come? I needed you, Benny." The voice, Mike's voice, but distorted, twisted, laced with a chilling undercurrent of something else. The shadowy tendrils reached for me, flowing across the floor, up the walls, like living darkness. The monstrous animal shapes shifted, their eyes, those points of light, fixed on me, hungry, expectant. "Guilt," the voice whispered, Mike's voice, Nix's voice, something else's voice. "It feeds us, Benny, it makes us strong, and you have so much guilt, don't you, Benny?" It was right. The guilt, a constant ache in my chest, a weight I carried everywhere. Guilt for Mike, guilt for Maria, guilt for all the things I hadn't done, all the things I should have done. The station, Ranger Station 7. It wasn't just a building, it was a conduit, a focus. It was feeding the shadow walker, feeding it with fear, with isolation, with guilt. It was drawing power from the darkness, from the mountain itself, from something else entirely. But training, muscle memory, something deep and ingrained, kicked in. Not ranger training, not really. Something older, something primal, fight or flight, and fight this time, fight. The flare gun, locked in the weapons locker in the storage room. Stupidly, ridiculously, it was the only weapon I had, a bright burst of light against a creature of shadow. But it was something. A chance. I moved suddenly, violently, a burst of adrenaline propelling me forward. I scrambled past the reaching tendrils, dodging the monstrous shapes, toward the storage room door, the one I'd seen creak open, now yawning wide into deeper darkness. Keys hanging by the door. My fingers fumbled, clumsy with cold and fear, snatching them from the hook. The locker, ancient metal, groaning as I wrestled with the lock. Click. Open. Flare gun, heavy in my hand, shells, bright red plastic clattering into my palm. Turn, face the darkness, face the nightmare. The shadow walker blocking the doorway, its form coalescing, solidifying. No longer tendrils, no longer animals. Something vaguely human now, but still wrong, still distorted, its face a mask of shadows, those points of light burning like cold stars. "Benny, don't run, don't hide," Mike's voice pleading, accusing. Number not Mike, not anymore. This wasn't grief, this wasn't memory. This was something else, something that preyed on grief, on memory, on fear. This was the shadow walker. Flare gun raised, aimed at those points of light, at that void where a face should be. Deep breath, steady hand, trigger pulled. Crack, the flare erupted, a blinding white-hot burst of light filling the station, washing away the shadows, banishing the darkness. The shadow walker shrieked, a sound that ripped through the air, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. Its form recoiled, dissolving, flickering, like smoke in a sudden wind. I didn't wait to see what happened next. Flare gun still smoking in my hand, I ran. Out of the station, into the night, into the forest, into the cold, biting rain that had started to fall again. I ran blindly, desperately, crashing through undergrowth, leaping over fallen logs, driven by pure, unreasoning terror. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until I couldn't run anymore. Then I walked, stumbling, falling, getting up again, moving forward, always forward, away from Station 7, away from the Shadow Mountain, away from the darkness. Hours, it took hours, hiking through the night, guided only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the clouds, by the distant promise of civilization. Dawn found me on the edge of the forest, stumbling onto a logging road, my clothes torn, my body bruised, my mind shattered. Dispatch, a ranger truck parked by the side of the road. A ranger leaning against it, smoking a cigarette. Salvation. He stared at me, eyes widening as he took in my disheveled state, my wild eyes, the flare gun still clutched in my hand. "Station 7?" he asked, his voice low, hesitant. "Deputy Carter." I nodded, unable to speak, my throat raw, my voice gone. He understood. He'd seen it before, maybe. Or maybe he just saw the raw, naked terror in my eyes. "Let's go," he said, his voice gentle. "Let's get you out of here." And I went, leaving Station 7, leaving Shadow Mountain, leaving the darkness and the whispers and the shadow walker behind. But I knew, even then, as I climbed into the warm ranger truck, as the forest receded behind us, that I wouldn't be leaving it all behind. Some shadows once seen cling to you forever, and some places are just best left alone, especially after dark, especially in Shadow Mountain, especially at Station 7. The Vanishing Point Trail wasn't just a name. It was a promise, whispered in hushed tones around flickering campfires and in the shadowed corners of online hiking forums. A promise of something more than just a trail, more than just woods, more like a threshold. We'd been hiking for hours, Sarah, Tom, Emily, and me, Mark. 4 friends, 4 headlamps cutting cones through the deepening twilight of Blackwood National Forest. We'd come chasing that more, seduced by the trail's unnerving reputation, a dare to ourselves, really. The Vanishing Point Trail, where reality thinned, where people changed, or so the legends went. Initially, it was just a hike, albeit a strenuous one. Blackwood lived up to its name. The trees were ancient, towering hemlocks and pines that choked out the last vestiges of daylight. The air hung heavy, damp, and cold even for late autumn. We'd started joking about the trail's ominous name, Sarah ever the jovial one, mimicking a ghost voice. "Ooh, vanishing point. Beware hikers lest ye vanish." Tom, always the skeptic, just rolled his eyes, muttering something about overactive imaginations and Reddit clickbait. Emily, quiet and introspective, said little, but I could see her eyes, wide and searching, absorbing the deepening shadows, as if the forest itself were whispering secrets only she could hear. It started subtly, the disorientation. My compass, usually a reliable companion, began to spin erratically, the needle jittering like a nervous tick. I checked my map, a topographical printout I'd painstakingly studied, but the landmarks seemed to shift, the contours blurring into an indecipherable mess of lines. Time, too, began to warp. The afternoon had stretched on, the sun seeming to hang suspended just above the tree line, never quite setting, never quite moving. We lost track of hours, then minutes, existing in a strange, timeless bubble within the woods. Sarah, always eager to scout ahead, veered off the trail for a moment, promising to check out a particularly interesting rock formation. She was gone maybe 5 minutes, 10 at most, but when she returned, she was different. Paler somehow, her usual boisterous energy replaced by a quiet, almost trembling stillness. "Sarah, you okay?" I'd asked, concern lacing my voice. She just shook her head, her eyes unfocused, staring past us into the dense wall of trees. I don't know," she'd whispered, her voice hoarse, "just felt cold, really cold, and something was watching." She couldn't elaborate, couldn't explain what had shaken her so profoundly in those few moments off the trail. Tom, ever the pragmatist, dismissed it as fatigue, the growing chill, the psychological effect of the trail's reputation. "Just nerves, Sarah. We're all a little on edge. Let's keep moving, get to the clearing before it's completely dark." But even Tom's carefully constructed logic began to fray. He started checking his watch constantly, even though the numbers seemed meaningless in this timeless wood. He'd clear his throat, adjust his backpack, small, repetitive movements that betrayed a growing unease he tried to mask with forced nonchalance. He started talking more too, a nervous chatter about mundane things, the weather back home, the upcoming football season, anything to fill the oppressive silence that had fallen over the woods. His jokes, usually sharp and witty, fell flat, laced with a forced cheerfulness that was more unsettling than comforting. Emily, always the most attuned to the subtle currents of emotion, grew increasingly withdrawn. She'd walk silently, her gaze fixed on the deepening shadows, her brow furrowed in a perpetual frown. She'd stop abruptly sometimes, turning her head as if listening to something we couldn't hear. "It's watching us," she'd say, her voice barely audible. "The forest. It's alive, and it's watching." We'd try to reassure her, to tell her it was just the atmosphere, the isolation playing tricks on her mind, but her certainty was unnerving. She saw something we didn't, felt something we couldn't, and her fear, so palpable, so deeply rooted, began to infect us all. Then Sarah vanished. It was dusk, the last sliver of light bleeding from the sky, painting the fog in shades of bruised purple and sickly gray. We were approaching another rise, the trail winding upwards through a particularly dense patch of trees. Sarah, still shaken from her earlier experience, insisted on scouting ahead again, claiming she needed to stretch her legs, to shake off the chill. We hesitated, but she was insistent, her forced cheerfulness a brittle mask over her underlying fear. "Just a quick peek, guys, see what's over the rise, be right back." She disappeared into the fog, her headlamp beam bobbing ahead, then swallowed by the swirling mist. We waited huddled together, the silence amplifying the growing dread in our chests. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Sarah, you okay?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. No response. We called again, louder this time, our voices cracking with anxiety. Still nothing, just the rustling of leaves, the sigh of the wind, or was it a sigh? Everything in that forest seemed to twist, to echo with a double meaning, a hidden threat. Tom, his carefully constructed wall of logic finally crumbling, started to panic. "She's just messing with us, right? Sarah, come on, this isn't funny." He started off down the trail, his pace quickening, his voice rising in desperation. "Sarah." Sarah, Emily, and I followed, our headlamps cutting frantic swaths through the fog. We called her name, shouted until our voices were raw, our throats burning, but there was no reply. No answering call, no rustle of movement, nothing. Sarah was gone, vanished. As if the vanishing point trail had lived up to its name, claiming its first victim. Panic, raw and visceral, seized Tom. Denial warred with terror in his eyes. "She can't just disappear. She's here somewhere. We just have to find her. We have to keep going." He started pushing deeper into the woods, his pace frantic, driven by a desperate hope that bordered on delusion. "Tom, wait," I yelled, but he was already disappearing into the fog, his headlamp beam a fading beacon in the swirling mist. Emily and I hesitated, caught between our fear and a desperate loyalty to our friend. Then I saw it. The forest was distorting, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but subtly, insidiously. The trees, those ancient, towering hemlocks, seemed to shift, their trunks bending at impossible angles, their branches intertwining in geometries that defied Euclidean space. The fog, no longer just fog, pulsed with an inner light, a sickly, phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. The trail, the path we'd been so desperately clinging to, wasn't just disorienting, it was unraveling. It wasn't a path at all. It was a doorway. A vanishing point. "Emily," I whispered, my voice trembling, "we have to go back. Now, this trail, it's not." "Right." She looked at me, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. She'd felt it too, the shift, the unreality creeping in at the edges of our perception. "Tom," I shouted again, my voice cracking with desperation. "Tom, come back, we have to go." He didn't hear me, or maybe he did and didn't care. Driven by his panic, his denial, he kept pushing forward, deeper into the woods, deeper into the fog. He stepped off the trail, just a single step, a slight deviation from the barely visible path, and then he was gone. Not swallowed by the fog, not hidden by the trees. Gone. His body, his form, seemed to dissolve, like an image fading from a photograph, like a whisper lost on the wind. One moment he was there, a solid figure in the swirling mist, the next. Nothing, just empty fog. Emily screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure, unadulterated terror. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back, away from the edge of the trail, away from the vanishing point. "Run," I gasped, my voice hoarse. "Run, Emily, run." And we ran. Back the way we'd come, back towards the faint memory of the logging road, back towards any semblance of reality. We didn't speak, didn't look back, just ran, our lungs burning, our legs aching, driven by a terror that eclipsed even the most rational thought. I don't know how long we ran. Time had ceased to have meaning on that trail. The forest seemed to twist and turn around us, as if actively trying to impede our escape. Shadows danced at the edges of our vision. The whispers, fainter now, seemed to mock our desperate flight. But we kept running, clinging to each other, our headlamps' beams bouncing frantically ahead, searching for any sign of escape, any glimmer of hope. Finally, miraculously, the trees began to thin. The fog, though still dense, seemed less oppressive. We stumbled onto something that resembled a road, a wider path, barely visible under the undergrowth, but a path nonetheless. The logging road. We'd made it back, or at least closer to back. We didn't stop running until we reached Marcus's Jeep, parked where we'd left it. Impossibly normal, impossibly real in the face of the surreal horror we'd just escaped. The drive out was a blur. Emily sat beside me, silent, her eyes wide and vacant, staring straight ahead. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that fog, that thing pursuing us, spilling out of the woods and onto the road. But there was nothing. Just the empty blacktop, the receding trees, the fading memory of the Vanishing Point Trail. We stumbled out of the woods, physically and psychologically scarred. Sarah and Tom were gone, swallowed by the forest, claimed by the vanishing point. Emily, though physically present, seemed diminished. A part of her had been left behind on that trail, lost in that unseen dimension. And me. I was haunted. Haunted by the fog, by the whispers, by the image of Tom dissolving into nothingness, by the terrifying certainty that what we'd encountered wasn't just a figment of our imaginations. The police investigation was perfunctory, dismissive. Missing hikers, unfortunate accident, exposure, the usual bureaucratic platitudes. They searched the trail, of course, but found nothing. No trace of Sarah or Tom, no sign of anything unusual. Just an unmarked trail in a remote section of forest. The Vanishing Point Trail, they called it in the reports, a name that now echoed with a chilling irony. I know what I saw. I know what we experienced. The Vanishing Point Trail isn't just a trail, it's a doorway to somewhere else. Somewhere beyond the veil of reality, somewhere where the rules of our world don't apply. And Sarah and Tom, they stepped through that doorway. They vanished, not just from the trail, but from our world. I'm the only survivor. Emily, she's still here physically, but she's never been the same. The light in her eyes is dimmer now, replaced by a shadow of something she can't articulate, a knowing silence that's more terrifying than any scream. We don't talk about it, not really. The Vanishing Point Trail is a closed chapter, a locked room in the back of our minds, a horror we can't bear to revisit. But sometimes in the quiet darkness of night I hear the whispers again. Faint, almost imperceptible, but there. Whispers carried on the wind, whispers from the forest, whispers from beyond the veil. And I know with a chilling certainty that the Vanishing Point Trail is still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting hikers, waiting to claim its next victims, waiting to pull more souls into the terrifying, unseen dimension that lies just beyond the thin veil of our reality. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel it, watching me. The water tasted wrong. That's the first thing I really remember about Whispering Falls. Not the drive, though the endless curves of the Appalachian backroads had turned Leo, my son, a rather unsettling shade of green. Not the campsite itself, though it was objectively idyllic. No, it was the water. I'd filled our canteens from the stream burbling through the campground, the one that gave the place its name, and even through the metallic tang of our trusty aluminum bottles, there was something off. A faint, almost imperceptible sweetness, layered beneath a dull, cloying mineral taste. "Dad, this water tastes funny," Leo had said, wrinkling his nose as he took a tentative sip. He was 12, all elbows and knees and boundless, if occasionally misguided, enthusiasm. Camping had been his idea, a bonding trip he called it. Truth was, it was as much for me as for him. Work had been a pressure cooker lately, deadlines and demands piling up until I felt like I was drowning in spreadsheets and conference calls. Maria's absence, a raw, gaping wound still fresh after 6 months, hadn't helped. The city air felt stale, the familiar streets like a cage. I needed the woods, the quiet, the smell of pine needles and damp earth. Leo, bless him, seemed to sense it. "Funny how?" I'd asked, taking a swig from my own canteen. I tasted it too, that odd sweetness, but dismissed it. "Just mountain water probably, extra minerals, good for you." He'd eyed me skeptically, but being 12 and therefore perpetually thirsty, he drank anyway. We set up camp then, the familiar ritual a small comfort. The tent, a battered 2-man dome we'd had for years, went up quickly. Leo, energized by the fresh air and the promise of adventure, scampered around, gathering firewood, his usual teenage sullenness replaced by an infectious grin. Whispering Falls lived up to its name. The stream chuckled and gurgled over moss-covered stones, a constant, soothing murmur that filled the clearing. Sunlight dappled through the dense canopy, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. It was beautiful, serene, exactly what the brochure had promised. The first night was uneventful. We roasted hot dogs over a crackling fire, Leo regaling me with tales of his latest video game exploits. I listened, nodding, trying to be present, to push back the ever-present shadow of Maria that clung to the edges of my mind. Sleep came easily, exhaustion wrapping me in a thick blanket, but it wasn't restful. The dreams started then, vivid and unsettling. I remember darkness, a deep, suffocating blackness, punctuated by flashes of bioluminescent green. Fungus, I think, vast fields of it, pulsing with an inner light, stretching towards me, tendrils reaching. I woke with a jolt, heart hammering, the tent suddenly feeling claustrophobic. The air was heavy, thick, and that sweet, metallic taste was back in my mouth, stronger now, coating my tongue like syrup gone bad. "You okay, Dad?" Leo mumbled from his sleeping bag, his voice thick with sleep. "Just a bad dream," I'd said, forcing a reassuring smile. "Go back to sleep." But sleep was a long time coming. I lay there listening to the forest, the usual night sounds now tinged with an undercurrent of something else, something wrong, a subtle disharmony, a note out of key in nature's symphony. The next day things started to shift, subtly at first, then with an alarming acceleration. The rash appeared in the morning, a faint, itchy redness spreading across my forearms. I dismissed it as poison ivy, though I couldn't recall brushing against any. Leo complained of the same rash, his spreading across his neck and chest. We applied some antiseptic cream from the first aid kit, but it didn't seem to help. The metallic taste in the water intensified. I tried boiling it, hoping to purify it, but the taste remained, that cloying sweetness now bordering on nauseating. We switched to bottled water, but even that seemed tainted somehow, the plastic bottle carrying a faint, fungal aroma. Leo's behavior began to change. He became withdrawn, quiet, the boundless energy of the first day replaced by a listlessness that worried me. He spent hours staring into the woods, his usual chatter replaced by a brooding silence. He developed an unnatural fascination with the fungi growing around the campsite. Whispering Falls was, admittedly, a fungal paradise. Everywhere you looked, there were mushrooms, toadstools, bracket fungi clinging to fallen logs, a riot of shapes and colors. But Leo's fascination was different. It wasn't curiosity, it was absorption. He'd crouch down, inches from a cluster of iridescent fungi, his eyes glazed over, lost in some unseen world. "Leo, come on, let's go for a hike," I'd say, trying to pull him away. He'd resist, his small hand surprisingly strong, his gaze fixed on the fungal growth. "They're talking to me, Dad," he mumbled once, his voice distant, almost dreamy. "Who's talking to you, buddy?" I'd asked, kneeling beside him, concern tightening in my chest. He just pointed a trembling finger at the fungi, his eyes wide, unfocused. Them. The local flora and fauna started acting strangely too. Plants grew in unnatural patterns, vines twisting into spiral shapes I'd never seen before. Flowers bloomed out of season, their colors too vibrant, too intense. The birds, initially plentiful and vocal, grew silent, then disappeared altogether. Even the stream seemed different, the gentle burble replaced by a sluggish, almost viscous flow, the water taking on a milky, opalescent sheen. We decided to hike further afield, to get away from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of our campsite. We followed a faint trail deeper into the woods, hoping to find a ranger station, or at least cell service. That's when we stumbled upon them, the abandoned campsites. Not just one but several, scattered through the woods like discarded toys. Tents ripped and torn, sleeping bags slashed open, cooking equipment overturned, food scattered untouched, as if whoever had been here had fled in absolute terror. Disturbing organic residue was everywhere, a viscous, grayish-white substance that clung to tents, trees, and ground. smelling faintly of yeast and decay. "What the hell?" I'd muttered, my blood running cold. Leo was silent, his eyes wide, taking it all in, his face unnervingly calm. We found a discarded map in one of the abandoned campsites, crumpled and stained with that same grayish-white substance. It was a Whispering Falls campground map, but with strange markings, circles and spirals drawn in thick black ink, radiating outwards from a central point, a point that seemed to be our campsite. My compass started malfunctioning. The needle spun erratically, refusing to settle on north, as if the very earth itself was rejecting direction. The woods seemed to disorient us, familiar landmarks shifting, trails twisting back on themselves. It felt like the forest itself was pushing us back, trapping us within its increasingly malevolent embrace. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice tight with a fear I couldn't quite name. Sarah nodded, her face pale, her eyes haunted. "Now." But getting out wasn't going to be easy. The woods had closed in, the path back to the logging road, our only escape route, seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the deepening fog and the increasingly oppressive presence of the forest. We were trapped. Whispering Falls wasn't idyllic. It was infected. Leo's illness escalated rapidly. The rash spread, morphing into raised, weeping welts, the skin beneath peeling away in papery flakes. He grew feverish, his body burning to the touch, yet he shivered constantly, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. His mind seemed to slip further away, his eyes vacant, his speech rambling, nonsensical, peppered with phrases that made no sense, yet somehow felt deeply, chillingly wrong. "The roots are calling, Dad," he'd whisper, his voice raspy, his eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond my shoulder. "They want us to join them. They want us to be one." The fungal growths appeared next, small, white, button-like protrusions erupting from his skin, first on his neck, then his arms, spreading with terrifying speed. They pulsed faintly, that bioluminescent green glow shimmering beneath the surface. Body horror. That's the only term that even came close to describing what was happening to my son. My imaginative, curious Leo was being consumed. His identity, his very essence, was being warped, twisted, taken over by something else. He started trying to lure me deeper into the woods. "Come on, Dad," he'd say, his voice eerily smooth, devoid of its usual childish inflections. "They're waiting for us. They want to show you something, something beautiful." He'd point deeper into the forest, his eyes gleaming with that unnatural light towards the source I realized with a sickening jolt of the infection. The campsite itself. Whispering Falls Campground wasn't just a place. It was a source, a nexus, a point of origin. The fungus wasn't just in the water, it was emanating from the ground, rising up through the very earth beneath our feet. The campsite was infected. We were infected. "No, Leo," I'd say, my voice trembling, backing away from him. "We're not going anywhere. We're staying right here. We're going to get better. We're going to get out of here." But hope felt like a fragile thing, a flickering candle in the face of an encroaching storm. Desperation clawed at me. I had to isolate him to contain the infection, to create a barrier, however flimsy, against the fungal spores that filled the air, that permeated everything. Fire. That was the answer. Fire and natural repellents. I dragged Leo, protesting weakly, back to the fire pit, the dying embers of our last fire now cold and gray. I scavenged for dry wood, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I piled branches high, soaked them in gasoline from the RV's emergency canister, and struck a match. The flames erupted, a roaring inferno pushing back the encroaching darkness, a defiant beacon against the horror that surrounded us. I gathered pine needles, juniper branches, anything I could find that smelled pungent, that might repel the spores. I built a ring of burning foliage around our campsite, a fragile perimeter of smoke and flame, a desperate quarantine. Leo watched me, his eyes vacant, his fungal growths pulsing with that eerie green light. He fought against the fungus's influence. I could see it in the flicker of recognition that occasionally flashed in his eyes, in the tremor in his voice when he called out my name. Agonizing hours crawled by. I fed the fire, tending it like a lifeline, chanting reassurances to Leo, prayers to a God I wasn't sure I believed in. The shortwave radio, another of Isaac's security precautions, crackled to life after what felt like an eternity of static. A faint, distorted voice, barely audible above the crackle and hiss. Mayday, Whispering Falls, infected, need, help. I grabbed the microphone, my hand trembling so badly I could barely hold it steady. Mayday, Mayday, this is David, Whispering Falls campground, infected campsite, son, infected, need immediate medical assistance. My voice broke, choked with fear and exhaustion. I repeated the message, again and again into the static void, praying someone was listening, praying help would come before it was too late, before the fungus claimed us both, before Leah was lost completely, before Whispering Falls campground became our final infected grave. The wait was a living hell. Leo's condition worsened, the fungal growth spreading, his body contorting, his mind fading further into the fungal network. He screamed, not human screams, but choked, guttural cries that tore at my soul. He begged me to let him go, to join them, to become one. I held him close, whispering reassurances, my tears mingling with the sweat and pus that oozed from his infected skin. Then through the fog-choked dawn I heard it, the distant thrum of a helicopter growing louder, closer, a sound that was sweeter than any music, more beautiful than any bird song. Rescue. They came in hazmat suits, figures moving like ghosts in the swirling fog, their faces obscured by respirators. They took Leo, carefully, gently, his small body limp and unresponsive. They took me too, though I resisted, wanting to stay, to fight, to burn the whole infected place to the ground. But they pulled me away, into the helicopter, leaving Whispering Falls campground behind, quarantined, cordoned off. A silent, fog-shrouded warning of nature's hidden horrors. Whispering Falls is still quarantined. The news reports called it a localized biohazard event, contained and under control. But I know better. I know what's waiting there beneath the surface, in the earth, in the trees, in the very air itself. I see it sometimes in my dreams, those vast fields of pulsing green fungus, stretching, reaching. And sometimes, when the air is damp and cold, I taste it again, that faint, cloying sweetness, a silent, insidious reminder of the horrors hidden in seemingly idyllic nature, of the infection that waits, patient and ancient in the deep woods, whispering, always whispering, for us to join them to be. It had come once. It started with a howl, a sound that clawed its way into Cold Springs Valley, twisting through the ancient redwoods like a shard of ice in the wind. We were barely an hour into the Alorn Ridge Trail, a path carved into the heart of Redwood National Park, seeking that sweet ache of exertion and the raw beauty only deep wilderness can offer. I'm Greg, by the way, and I was leading the charge as usual. Late 20s experienced hiker, the kind of guy who reads trail maps for fun. With me were Lisa, my girlfriend, athletic as hell but sometimes a little, tightly wound, especially in the wild. Then there was Chris, our resident skeptic, pragmatic to a fault, always ready with a logical explanation even when logic was clearly packing its bags and leaving town. And Maria, the quiet one, the intuitive one. She felt things, saw things others missed, and sometimes it was unsettlingly accurate. We'd come to Cold Springs for the challenge, the isolation. Redwood National Park is vast, but even within its sprawling embrace, Cold Springs Valley held a reputation for being particularly remote, a place where the fog hung thick, the terrain unforgiving, and the silence profound. Rewarding, the guidebooks called it. They conveniently left out the part about the unnerving stillness, the way the redwoods seemed to watch you, their silent giants indifferent to your intrusion. The howl cut through the afternoon quiet, distant at first, almost swallowed by the rustling canopy. It wasn't like any animal I recognized. Not a coyote's yip, not a wolf's mournful cry, not even the drawn-out bay of a mountain lion. This was different. Deeper, somehow, resonating in a register that vibrated in your chest more than your ears. "Coyote?" Lisa asked, her voice a little too high, a tremor I knew too well. I shrugged, trying to sound casual. Probably sounded a bit off though, didn't it? Chris scoffed, ever the pragmatist. Probably just echoes, valleys known for them, wind playing tricks. Maria, however, stopped dead in her tracks, head cocked, eyes narrowed as if she were listening to something we couldn't hear. "That wasn't wind," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the whisper of the breeze. "That was alive." We pushed on, dismissing it as just wildlife, the kind of ambient noise you expect in the deep woods. But the howl returned, sooner than we expected, and closer this time. It echoed through the valley, bouncing off the canyon walls, wrapping around us, making it impossible to pinpoint its origin. It felt everywhere. Lisa's anxiety ratcheted up a notch. "Okay, that's definitely not a coyote. What the hell is that?" Chris, despite his skepticism, was starting to look uneasy. He kept glancing around, his usual cocky grin replaced by a tight-lipped frown. Still echoes, probably, just stronger now. Maria remained silent, her brow furrowed, her gaze fixed on the dense undergrowth that flanked the trail. She had that look again, the one that meant she was seeing something we weren't, sensing something beyond our immediate perception. The howls grew more frequent, more insistent. They weren't just random animal cries anymore, they were becoming almost conversational. They echoed and bounced, replying to themselves in a way that felt unnatural, deliberate. It was like something was calling out, not just to us, but to the valley itself, filling the silence with a chilling, unseen presence. Lisa was starting to panic. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes darting nervously around the increasingly darkening woods. "Greg, this isn't funny anymore. That thing sounds like it's hunting us." "It's just a sound, Lisa," Chris said, trying to reassure her, but his voice lacked conviction now. Even he was beginning to crack. "Probably some weird bird or something." "It's not a bird, Chris," Maria said, her voice low and steady, but with an edge of something that made my own skin crawl. "It's intelligent. It's listening to us." And then the howls began to change again. Subtly at first, almost imperceptibly. But gradually, chillingly, they started to mimic sounds. Sounds from our past. Sounds that were deeply personal, intimately tied to our own individual fears and insecurities. For Lisa, it started with a whimper, a soft, mournful sound that echoed through the valley, superimposed over the deeper, more primal howl. It was a dog whimpering. Not just any dog, but Buster, her childhood golden retriever, who'd been hit by a car when she was 10. A sound she hadn't heard in years, yet instantly recognized, instantly felt in the pit of her stomach like a cold stone. Lisa froze, her face paling. No, that's Buster." Her voice trembled, disbelief and dawning horror warring in her eyes. Chris, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize it away. "Wind, Lisa, just the wind, playing with the echoes." But his words were weak, hollow even to his own ears. Then it was Chris's turn. The howl shifted again, the deep, resonant cry morphing into something sharper, angrier. It was a shout, distorted and amplified by the valley walls, but undeniably a shout. A man's shout. Chris flinched, his pragmatic facade crumbling, replaced by a flicker of something raw, something vulnerable. That's my father," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "When he was angry." Chris hadn't spoken about his father in years, a man known for his volatile temper, his booming voice that used to fill their small house with shouts and recriminations. A voice Chris had tried to bury, to forget. And now, here it was, echoing through Cold Springs Valley, dredged up from the darkest corners of his memory. For Maria, the shift was more subtle, more insidious. The howl softened, the primal cry giving way to a melody, faint and wavering at first, then growing clearer, more haunting. It was a lullaby, a tune sung in a language none of us recognized, yet Maria's eyes widened, tears welling up. "My grandmother," she breathed, her voice choked with emotion. "Her lullaby from when I was a child." Maria's grandmother, who'd raised her, had passed away years ago. Maria hadn't heard that lullaby since she was a little girl. Yet the howler, this unseen predator in the woods, was singing it back to her. A ghostly echo of a love and loss she thought she'd long since reconciled. And then it was my turn. The howl changed one last time, the deep, resonant cry softening, becoming almost human. It was a voice, distorted and echoing, but undeniably a voice. A woman's voice, my voice, but not quite, it was. Higher pitched, laced with a familiar cadence, a tone that made my heart clench with a pain I thought I'd buried. "Greg," the voice echoed through the valley, my name distorted, stretched, made alien by the echoing canyon walls. "Greg, why did you leave?" It was Sarah's voice. My Sarah, my ex-girlfriend, the woman who'd walked out of my life 6 months ago, leaving behind a wreckage of unanswered questions and lingering guilt. A voice I hadn't heard since the last bitter argument, a voice I desperately wanted to forget. Yet here it was, called up from the depths of Cold Springs Valley, weaponized, twisted into a tool of psychological torment. The howls were no longer just sounds. They were weapons, targeted, precise, designed to dismantle us from the inside out. The howler wasn't just hunting us physically. It was hunting our minds, our memories, our deepest fears and insecurities. It was feeding on our terror. We were cornered, not by a physical barrier, but by the valley itself, by the echoing walls of Cold Springs Canyon that amplified the howler's terrifying symphony of our past traumas. The canyon narrowed, the trail twisting and turning, each bend revealing the same inescapable walls, the same oppressive redwoods, the same echoing, mocking howls. The howls were deafening now, amplified by the canyon, bouncing off the sheer rock faces, surrounding us in a cacophony of terror. Buster's whimpering, my father's angry shouts, my grandmother's lullaby, Sarah's accusing voice, they intertwined, layered over each other, a chorus of our deepest anxieties and doubts, orchestrated by the unseen predator that stalked us through the fog-shrouded woods. Lisa was on the verge of a full-blown panic attack, her breath coming in ragged gasps, tears streaming down her face. Chris, his pragmatism shattered, was staring blankly ahead, his eyes wide and unfocused, lost in the echo of his father's rage. Maria was curled in on herself, sobbing softly, her grandmother's lullaby a ghostly soundtrack to her despair. And I was drowning in Sarah's voice and the echo of my own guilt and regret. "Greg, why did you leave? Greg, why weren't you enough? Greg, why?" That's when it hit me. The howler wasn't just mimicking sounds. It was manipulating them, twisting them, weaponizing them. It was feeding on our fear, using our own past against us, preying on our psychological vulnerabilities. It wasn't just a predator. It was a psychological tormentor, a master manipulator of fear. And then something shifted within me. A spark of defiance, a flicker of anger, a refusal to be prey. I looked at my friends, at Lisa's trembling form, Chris's vacant stare, Maria's silent tears. We were being dismantled, taken apart piece by this unseen psychological predator. And I realized with a chilling clarity that the only way to survive wasn't to run, wasn't to hide, but to fight back. Not physically, not with weapons, but psychologically, with our minds, with our unity, with our defiance. "Enough," I roared, my voice cutting through the cacophony of howls, echoing through the canyon, surprisingly strong, surprisingly clear. "Enough." Lisa flinched, Chris blinked, Maria looked up, startled. For a moment the howls faltered, the orchestrated symphony of terror disrupted by my unexpected outburst. "It's feeding on our fear," I shouted, my voice raw, desperate, but with a newfound conviction. "It's using our past against us, our memories, our anxieties, but we don't have to let it." I grabbed Lisa's hand, her cold, trembling fingers clenching around mine. "Lisa, Buster loved you. He wasn't afraid of you, he was loved." Lisa's eyes met mine, a flicker of recognition, a spark of defiance igniting in their tear-filled depths. He did," she whispered, her voice gaining strength. "He loved me." I turned to Chris, placing a hand on his shoulder, feeling the rigid tension in his muscles. "Chris, you're not your father, you're stronger than him, you're better than him." Chris straightened, his vacant stare hardening, his jaw clenching. "I am," he said, his voice low, firm. "I am." Finally, I knelt beside Maria, taking her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin despite the chilling fog. "Maria, your grandmother loved you. Her lullaby was a song of love, not fear. Remember the love, Maria, remember the strength." Maria's tears slowed, her gaze focusing, her eyes clearing. "Love," she repeated, her voice soft but resolute. "Love is stronger." And then we howled. Not a howl of terror, not a whimper of fear, but a howl of defiance, a scream of unity, a counter-howl thrown back into the echoing canyon. Lisa's voice, strong and clear, joined mine. Chris roared, his voice booming with a newfound strength. Maria's cry, clear and resonant, filled the valley with a defiant melody. We howled together, a chorus of defiance, a symphony of resilience, pushing back against the orchestrated terror that had threatened to consume us. We howled until our voices were raw, until our lungs burned, until the fear that had gripped us began to loosen its hold, replaced by a rising tide of anger, of defiance, of unity. And then the howler retreated. Its howls faltered, softened, became distant, fading into the echoing depths of Cold Springs Valley. The psychological hold it had exerted, the carefully crafted symphony of terror, disrupted, broken by our defiant counter-howl. We didn't wait, we didn't linger. We turned and ran, not in fear this time, but with purpose, with determination, with a shared understanding that fear could be both a weapon and a weakness in the wilderness. We ran until we were out of the canyon, out of the valley, out of Cold Springs, leaving behind the echoing howls, the unseen predator, the psychological torment. We escaped Cold Springs Valley, shaken, exhausted, emotionally raw, but we escaped. And in escaping, we found something we hadn't expected, something stronger than fear, something more powerful than any unseen predator lurking in the woods. We found each other. We found our unity. We found our defiance. And in the echoing silence that followed the howler's retreat, we found a strength we never knew we possessed. We found our way back, not just to the trailhead, but to ourselves, forever changed by the terror we had faced, forever bound by the shared ordeal we had overcome. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying and empowering discovery of all. They say the mountains keep secrets, and Eagle Peak, where I'm stationed this summer, is no exception. Perched atop this granite spire in the Cascades, my fire lookout tower feels less like a job post and more like a solitary confinement cell with a view. But what a view! Days unfold in panoramic sweeps of emerald forest and sapphire sky, a silent, majestic theater where I'm the only audience member. It's peaceful, profoundly so. Too peaceful, maybe. My name's Daniel, and I'm pushing 50, though some days, staring out at that endless green, I feel ancient, like one of those gnarled pines clinging to the cliff edge. Fire lookout duty isn't glamorous. It's weeks of solitude, punctuated by the static crackle of the radio and the occasional, blessedly mundane, call from dispatch. Most of my days are spent scanning the horizon, a pair of binoculars glued to my eyes, searching for the telltale wisp of smoke that could herald disaster. Nights are longer, quieter still. Just the wind sighing around the tower, the creaks and groans of the old wooden structure settling into the cold mountain air, and the vast, indifferent silence of the wilderness pressing in from all sides. I volunteered for this. After the divorce, after the city started to feel like a cage closing in, I needed space, altitude, something to clear the static in my own head, and for the first few weeks it worked. The rhythm of the mountain, the quiet routine of observation, it was therapeutic. I'd hike down to the spring for water, chop wood, read dog-eared paperbacks by the kerosene lamp, and watch the sun paint the sky in colors Maria used to name with such effortless grace. It was healing, I told myself. A necessary retreat. Then the radio started acting up. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A little more static than usual, frequencies bleeding into each other. Nothing alarming, just atmospheric interference, I told myself. Mountains do that, especially in the evenings. But it kept happening night after night, the static growing more persistent, more textured. It wasn't just white noise anymore. It was shaped, like whispers just below the threshold of hearing murmuring through the electronic hiss. I'd fiddle with the tuning dial, adjust the squelch, check the antenna connections. Nothing helped. The static remained a constant, low-grade hum beneath the official channels. I started avoiding the radio after dark, preferring the silence, even though silence in that tower could feel heavy. One evening, a week or so into my shift, I was making my nightly check-in with dispatch. Eagle Peak, evening check, all clear, visibility excellent. The dispatcher's voice, a woman named Carol, came back crisp and professional. Copy that, Eagle Peak. Weather's holding, but there's a front moving in tomorrow. Expect possible thunderstorms. Copy, dispatch, we'll keep an eye out. Routine, comforting. But then, as Carol signed off, I heard it, cutting through the static, distinct and chillingly clear. Daniels. Not Carol's voice. Deeper somehow, resonant, distorted like it was being stretched and pulled through the airwaves, yet undeniably a voice. Masculine, ancient. I froze, my hand hovering over the transmit button. Dispatch, did you say something else? I asked, my voice a little too loud in the quiet tower. Silence, then Carol's voice laced with a hint of static. Eagle Peak, negative. Did you copy weather advisory? Yeah, copied, just thought I heard something else. False alarm. I forced a chuckle, trying to sound casual, professional. Probably just the wind playing tricks. Roger that, Eagle Peak. Wind's picking up here too. Stay safe out there. 10-4. I signed off, my heart hammering against my ribs. Wind playing tricks. That voice hadn't been the wind, it had been intentional, directed. I told myself it was a fluke, a bleed-through from another channel, some trucker's CB radio echoing off the mountains. Logical explanations, that's what I needed. Logic, reason, not voices in the static. But the voice returned. Night after night, it wormed its way into the radio waves, always after dispatch signed off, always cutting through the static like a blade. Sometimes it was just my name, whispered, drawn out, chilling. Daniel. Other times it was fragments, broken sentences, riddles that made no sense, yet somehow, unsettlingly personal. Cold, so cold, it would murmur, the voice stretched and distorted as if speaking from the bottom of a well. Beneath the mountain sleeps. Sleep beneath the mountain, what the hell was that supposed to mean? I started logging the transmissions, scribbling down the fragments in my lookout journal, telling myself it was just for documentation, professionalism, park ranger protocol. Anything to avoid admitting, even to myself, that I was starting to get scared. The voice seemed to know things it shouldn't know. One night, after a particularly vivid dream about Maria, about the way her laughter used to fill our small apartment, the voice came through, clearer than ever before. She misses your laughter too, Daniel. I nearly jumped out of my skin. How could it know that? How could it know about Maria? I hadn't spoken her name aloud in weeks, hadn't even thought about her in detail, not consciously. Yet the voice, this disembodied presence in the radio waves, knew. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking, the microphone clutched tight in my hand. "Who are you? What do you want?" Static, then after a long, agonizing pause, the voice returned lower, almost a growl. "Release me, Daniel." "Release it? Release what? From where? And why me?" I was just a fire lookout, a middle-aged man trying to escape a broken heart, not some psychic conduit for mountain spirits. Dispatch started noticing the change in me. Carol's voice, always calm, always professional, began to carry a note of concern. "Eagle Peak, you sound strained. Everything all right up there?" "Yeah, fine, Dispatch," I'd lie, my voice tight. "Just, weather's been a little rough, long nights." "Roger that. Anything unusual to report?" "Unusual? How do you report a voice in the static that seems to know your deepest fears? How do you explain the feeling of being watched, not just by the forest, but by something else?" "Negative, Dispatch, all clear." Another lie, each lie a little heavier, a little more corrosive to my already fraying sanity. The weather started to reflect the growing unease in the tower. The thunderstorms Carol had predicted arrived, not as a passing front, but as a persistent, brooding presence. Heavy, low-hanging clouds clung to the mountain peaks, shrouding the forest in a perpetual twilight. Strange fog formations coiled and twisted around the tower, thicker than any natural mist, smelling faintly of ozone and the wind. The wind became unnatural, swirling in unpredictable patterns, gusting and dying, sighing and moaning, carrying those whispers from the radio, amplifying them, weaving them into the fabric of the mountain air. And the cold, a persistent bone-deep cold that seeped into the tower no matter how high I cranked the propane heater, no matter how many layers of clothing I put on. It wasn't just the temperature dropping. It was something else. An absence of warmth, a void where heat should have been. It felt predatory. One afternoon, staring out at the swirling fog, I noticed something truly impossible. The fog, instead of drifting and dissipating, was forming shapes, geometric patterns, spirals, and faces, distorted, fleeting, but undeniably faces, peering at me from the swirling mist. I grabbed my binoculars, my hands shaking, focusing on one particularly persistent formation. It coalesced, sharpened, resolving itself into eyes. 2 points of light in the swirling gray, fixed on the tower, cold, intelligent, and impossibly ancient. The radio crackled to life, not dispatch. The voice, clearer now, stronger, the distortion fading, replaced by a chillingly seductive tone. "Daniel, can you see me now?" My breath hitched in my throat. I lowered the binoculars, my gaze fixed on the fog shapes, those eyes, staring. "Who are you?" I whispered, the microphone forgotten in my trembling hand. "What are you?" The voice chuckled, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through the tower, through my bones. "I am what you fear, Daniel, what you have always feared, the darkness beneath, the silence between stars." Cosmic horror. That's what flashed through my mind, a term from some forgotten literature class, something about ancient evils and vast, unknowable forces. It felt fitting, terrifyingly fitting. "Beneath the mountain," the voice continued, the words now flowing smoothly, coherently, no longer broken fragments, no longer riddles. "I have been trapped for ages, sleeping, dreaming, waiting." "Trapped," I echoed, my voice barely audible, my mind struggling to grasp the impossible reality unfolding around me. "Trapped where?" "Here, Daniel, beneath your feet, within the stone. The mountain is my prison, and you are my key." "My key to what?" "To release this entity, this ancient darkness." The tower creaked around me, the wind howling, the fog pressing in, those eyes, watching. "Geological activity," the voice murmured as if reading my thoughts. "Deep tremors far below awakening me, stirring the prison bars, the radio waves. They are like threads, Daniel, thin, fragile, but they reach out, they touch you." The radio, the static, the whispers, it was using the radio waves to communicate to reach me. Release me, Daniel, the voice pleaded, the seductive tone deepening, becoming almost hypnotic. I offer you understanding, power, and end to your emptiness. Join me, Daniel, become part of the mountain, become eternal. Eternal, trapped beneath a mountain with this thing. Eternity sounded less like a gift and more like a sentence in hell, but the voice, it was persuasive, seductive. It played on my loneliness, my grief, my fear of insignificance. It offered me something tempting. Something wrong. But then I saw it. Through the swirling fog down the slope, a flicker of light. Not the unnatural blue-white glow of the entity, but a warmer, more familiar light. Headlights. Someone was coming. Dispatch, they were worried. They were coming to check on me. Salvation, or were they walking into a trap? Were they coming to release the darkness? No, I wouldn't let that happen. Not on my watch, not from my tower. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everything, the forest, the mountains, the world beyond. I ignored the voice's seductive pleas. I pushed aside the fear, the temptation, the overwhelming sense of cosmic dread. I grabbed the microphone, my hand still shaking, but my voice, when it came, was clear, resolute. Dispatch, Eagle Peak calling emergency. Code Black Alpha, repeat code Black Alpha, entity contact confirmed, repeat entity contact. Hostile, do not approach tower, do not attempt rescue. Seal off Sector 7, seal off, everything. Static crackled, then Carol's voice, sharp with alarm. Eagle Peak, say again, code Black Alpha, Daniel, what's going on up there? I didn't have time to explain. I had to warn them, had to get the message out. Dispatch, this is not a drill. Ancient entity, repeat ancient entity, awakened, trapped beneath Eagle Peak, using radio waves to communicate. Do not listen to its voice, do not release it. The voice roared in my ears, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. Traitor, you will pay for this, Daniel, you cannot stop me. I am inevitable. I ignored it. I focused on Carol's voice, on the flickering lights of the approaching vehicles, on the responsibility that weighed heavier than the mountain itself. Dispatch, activate emergency beacon, seal off Sector 7, and dispatch, tell Maria, tell her, I'm sorry. Then silence. The voice gone, replaced by the pulsing static of the emergency beacon, a desperate signal screaming into the night. I dropped the microphone, picked up my rifle, the one piece of protection they'd issued me, a symbolic gesture more than anything else. I knew it wouldn't stop whatever was coming, but I would stand my ground. I would defend my tower. I would be the barrier. The tower door rattled, slowly, deliberately testing its strength. Then footsteps, heavy, ponderous footsteps approaching through the fog, not human footsteps, something else, something, ancient something, inevitable. And I was alone, on Eagle Peak, the fire lookout, the last line of defense, and the footsteps. They were getting closer. The thing about trail cameras is they're supposed to capture the unseen. That's the whole point, isn't it? To glimpse the creatures that move in the shadows, the shy ones, the nocturnal wanderers. Devil's Gulch, though. Devil's Gulch captured something else entirely. My name is Elias Thorne. Dr. Elias Thorne, if you want to be formal, though out here in the wilderness, titles tend to evaporate like morning mist. I'm a wildlife biologist, mid-50s, and for the last 20 years I've dedicated my life to understanding the intricate tapestry of ecosystems, the delicate dance of predator and prey, the silent language of the wild. Devil's Gulch, a scar carved deep into the belly of the national forest, was my new obsession. It was remote, brutally so, inaccessible by any maintained trail, a jagged tear in the landscape that most rangers actively avoided. Perfect. Perfect for what I needed, which was isolation, pristine habitat, and a chance to study some of the more elusive fauna rumored to inhabit its shadowed depths. Elk, sure, maybe even a stray mountain lion pushing its territory boundaries. But the whispers, the old-timer tales. They spoke of something else, something bigger, rarer, more primal. So I packed my gear, a week's worth of freeze-dried rations, my trusty weather-beaten tent, and of course my arsenal of trail cameras. 5 of them state-of-the-art, motion-activated, infrared-capable. I wanted to see what lurked in Devil's Gulch, not just during the day but in the heart of the deepest night. I wanted to document the life that thrived unseen in that forgotten canyon. I was excited, genuinely thrilled. Scientific curiosity, you see, can be a powerful drug. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. Setting up the cameras was a chore, scrambling down rocky slopes, securing them to sturdy trees, camouflaging them with natural debris. Devil's Gulch lived up to its name. A steep, shadowed canyon, choked with dense undergrowth, sunlight struggling to penetrate the canopy even at midday. The air was cool, damp, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Something earthy, ancient, almost metallic. The initial images were reassuringly mundane. Deer mostly browsing through the underbrush, their eyes reflecting the infrared flash like twin embers. A black bear lumbering across a fallen log, its massive form surprisingly graceful. A bobcat, sleek and silent, its ears twitching, alert to unseen dangers. Textbook wildlife photography. Exactly what I expected, precisely what I was there to document. Then the anomaly started. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A blurry shape in the background of a deer photo, just at the edge of the frame, indistinct, easily dismissed as motion blur or a trick of the light. I almost deleted it, thought better of it, filed it away in a folder labeled Anomalies, just in case. The next day, another blurry shape, this time in a nighttime shot of what I assumed was a raccoon, the animal itself perfectly in focus, but behind it that same indistinct smear, darker than the surrounding foliage almost. Formless. I started reviewing the footage more closely, zooming in on the anomalies, adjusting contrast, trying to discern any recognizable shape. Nothing. Just blur, distortion, a visual smudge on the otherwise pristine images of the natural world. Equipment malfunction, I told myself. Moisture, maybe. Or just misidentification. My overactive imagination conjuring faces in the forest shadows. But the patterns were unsettling. The anomalies weren't random, they were appearing more frequently in different locations across different cameras, and they were evolving. The blurry shapes became less indistinct, started to suggest forms. Distorted animal figures, elongated limbs, unnatural angles, creatures that defied any known taxonomy. One image taken in broad daylight showed a mountain lion, magnificent, powerful, but behind it in sharp focus was something else. Something that mimicked the lion's form, but wrong. Its fur too dark, almost black, its body too lean, too stretched, its eyes. They were just black pits sucking in the light. I dismissed it again, rationalizing, explaining, clinging to scientific skepticism like a lifeline. Pareidolia, the human brain's tendency to see patterns where none exist. My mind was playing tricks on me, projecting my anxieties onto the data. Wildlife biology was a science, after all, grounded in empirical evidence, not ghost stories and blurry photographs. Then the cameras started capturing sounds. It started with static. Interference, I assumed, radio waves, atmospheric disturbances. But the static wasn't random. It pulsed, it throbbed, it seemed to sync with the blurry shapes in the images. And then beneath the static, I heard them. Whispers. Faint, indistinct, barely audible over the normal forest sounds, but undeniably there. Human voices, or something mimicking them, murmuring just beyond the range of comprehension. Whispers that seemed to call my name, to speak directly to some primal fear buried deep within my DNA. One recording taken late at night sent a shard of ice through my veins. It started with the static, that pulsing, rhythmic interference, then the whispers, fainter than usual, almost lost in the background noise of crickets and rustling leaves. And then a sound that made my blood run cold. A guttural growl, deep, resonant, animalistic, but with an unnatural undertone, a hint of intelligence. The growl faded, the whispers intensified, and then, clear as a bell, cutting through the static and the night sounds, I heard a single word. My name, Elias. Spoken in a voice that was not human, not animal, but something in between. A distorted mockery of human speech. A sound that resonated in my bones, that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. That was when I knew. This wasn't equipment malfunction, this wasn't pareidolia, this was something real, something else. I drove to the nearest ranger station the next morning, the memory of that whispered name echoing in my mind. Ranger Miller, late 40s, weathered face, eyes that had seen too much of the wilderness, listened to my story with a skeptical frown. Trail cameras malfunctioning, Doc, he said, leaning back in his chair, the fluorescent lights of the ranger station office buzzing overhead. Happens all the time. Moisture, temperature fluctuations, critters messing with them. I laid out the images on his desk, the blurry shapes, the distorted figures, the mountain lion with the black pit eyes. The recordings, the static, the whispers, the guttural growl, the whispered name. Miller leaned forward, his skepticism wavering, replaced by a flicker of something else, curiosity, concern. Static interference, he repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. He picked up the photo of the mountain lion, his brow furrowed. That's unusual. Mountain lions don't get that dark around here. It's not a mountain lion, Ranger, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Not like any mountain lion I've ever seen. He listened to the recordings, his face growing increasingly grim as the whispers filled the small office, the guttural growl vibrating the air, the whispered name hanging heavy between us. When the recording ended, he was silent for a long moment, staring at the speaker of my laptop as if expecting the voice to return. Devil's Gulch, he said finally, his voice low. That's a bad place, Doc. Bad place? I asked, my scientific curiosity battling with a growing sense of dread. Local legends, Miller shrugged, but his eyes didn't meet mine. Old wives' tales, mostly superstitions, but there are stories about things that live in the deep woods, things that change. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. I saw the unease in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the way he avoided looking directly at the images on his desk. He was a park ranger, a man of the outdoors, a man who dealt with bears and mountain lions and poachers and lost hikers. He wasn't easily spooked, and yet he was spooked. I'm going back, I said, my voice more determined than I felt. I need to retrieve the cameras, and I need to see what else they've captured. Miller hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'll go with you, he said, just to be safe, and Doc, be careful out there, some mysteries are best left unsolved. His words echoed in my mind as we hiked back into Devil's Gulch, the air heavy with an unnatural chill, the vegetation around us different, withered almost as if something had drained the life from it. The forest was silent, even more so than before. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of our boots on the dry leaves and the sound of our own breathing. We reached the clearing where I'd set up the cameras. The clearing was altered. The trees around the perimeter were blackened, their bark cracked and peeling, the symbols carved into them deeper, more pronounced. The air hung heavy, thick with that same metallic, ancient smell I'd noticed before, but stronger now, almost overpowering. The trail cameras were gone. Every single one. Ripped from their mountings, the straps torn, the housings shattered. Scattered on the ground were fragments of plastic and glass, the remnants of my scientific instruments, destroyed, obliterated. But it was the last camera, the one I'd placed closest to the dead tree, the one that had captured the clearest images of the blurry shapes, the one that had recorded the whispered name. It wasn't there at all. No fragments, no straps, nothing, just empty space. Miller and I searched the clearing, our flashlights cutting through the deepening twilight. We found nothing but destruction, an unnatural stillness, and a growing sense of dread that pressed down on us like a physical weight. Then Miller saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones, enormous, unlike any known animal. 3-toed, each toe ending in a sharp, claw-like point. Deep impressions in the dry earth suggesting immense weight. They led away from the clearing, deeper into the canyon, toward the heart of Devil's Gulch, toward the unseen, the unknown, the terrifying. We followed them for a short distance, the footprints growing larger, more frequent, the air growing colder, the silence more oppressive. Then Miller stopped, his hand on my arm, his face pale even in the fading light. "That's enough, Doc," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We're done here." I didn't argue. I couldn't. The fear was too strong, too primal, too overwhelming. I looked back at the footprints leading deeper and deeper into the shadows of Devil's Gulch, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that Ranger Miller was right. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. We turned and walked away, leaving Devil's Gulch undisturbed, leaving the darkness to reclaim its domain. But the images from those trail cameras, the whispers, the growls, the whispered name, the monstrous figure looming in the final frames, those images remain burned into my mind. A permanent reminder of the unseen horrors lurking in the wilderness, a constant whisper in the back of my consciousness. A chilling echo of the thing we left behind in Devil's Gulch, waiting, watching, always watching. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows grow long, I swear I can still hear that whispered name, carried on the wind, calling me back to the darkness. Elias. The air in Blackwood Ridge doesn't just chill your skin. It burrows into your bones, a cold that feels ancient, like the breath of something that's been sleeping for centuries. We should have known then, the moment we stepped out of Liam's Jeep and that mountain air hit us, that we were trespassing. But we were young, stupid, and hungry for the kind of thrill you only find when you're flirting with danger. It was Jake, me, who'd convinced them. Chloe, my girlfriend, adventurous as they come but with a nervous flutter in her chest about enclosed spaces. Liam, the cautious one, always with a logical counterpoint, a skeptical arch to his brow. And Maya, bless her, Maya with her head full of local lore, the one who actually made the legends of Blackwood Ridge sound like more than just campfire stories. "Come on," I'd said, that familiar thrill-seeker's itch under my skin. "It'll be epic. Abandoned silver mines, cursed, haunted. This is what we live for." We lived for it in that reckless early 20s way. Urban legends whispered online had become our siren song, tales of Blackwood Ridge and its mines, echoing with the promise of something undiscovered, something wrong. They said the old silver mines weren't just abandoned. They were empty. Emptied out by something that didn't want company. Blackwood Ridge itself was a scar on the map, a jagged mountain range swallowed by national forest, hours from anything resembling civilization. Perfect, we'd thought, for a weekend of urban exploration, a dive into the unknown. The mine entrance looked like a gaping maw in the hillside, a jagged tear in the green and brown tapestry of the forest. A rusted sign, barely clinging to its post, warned of danger, of collapse, of trespassers being prosecuted. We ignored it, of course. Danger was the point. The air changed the moment we stepped inside. The sunlight, the rustling leaves, the familiar sounds of the forest, they all vanished, replaced by a damp, heavy silence. The temperature plummeted instantly, not just cooler, but a clammy, subterranean cold that seeped through our layers of clothing. "Whoa," Chloe breathed, her usual bravado faltering. "It's different in here." Different was an understatement. It was like stepping out of the world we knew and into something else, something ancient and watchful. Our headlamps cut weak swathes through the inky blackness, revealing rough-hewn tunnels, walls slick with moisture, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else. something metallic like blood and rust. Initially there was excitement, a giddy rush of exploration. We were the first ones here in decades, maybe longer. We were uncovering secrets, pushing boundaries. The tunnels branched and twisted, a labyrinth of rock and darkness. We called out to each other, our voices echoing strangely, distorted, bouncing off the unseen walls in ways that didn't quite make sense. "Echoes are weird in here," Liam said, his voice tight even for him. "Sounds off." They were off, not just echoes but whispers. Faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to cling to the rock itself, like the mine was breathing, sighing, telling us to leave. We dismissed it, of course. Mines were old, unstable, full of drafts and strange acoustics. Just the wind, we told ourselves, playing tricks on our ears. Then came the claustrophobia. It started subtly, a tightening in my chest, a shortness of breath. But for Chloe, it hit like a physical blow. She'd always been a little uneasy in confined spaces, but down here in the absolute blackness, with the weight of the mountain pressing down on us, it was different. I don't like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's too tight, too closed in." Liam, ever practical, tried to reassure her. "Just breathe, Chloe, it's just a mine. Plenty of space, see?" He gestured with his headlamp, the beam swallowed by the darkness almost instantly. But there wasn't plenty of space. There was only rock, cold, oppressive rock closing in on all sides. It happened fast. We were navigating a narrow passage, Chloe in the lead, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then a tremor, a low rumble deep in the earth that vibrated through the rock beneath our feet. Chloe screamed. Not a scream of fright, but of raw, agonizing panic. A scream that echoed and echoed in the tunnels, bouncing off the unseen walls, distorted, amplified, until it felt like the mine itself was screaming with her. Then silence, abrupt, absolute silence. Chloe was gone. "Chloe," I yelled, my voice cracking. "Chloe, answer me." Only the echoes answered, mocking, empty. Liam's headlamp beam danced frantically, cutting through the darkness, searching, finding nothing. "Chloe," he shouted, his voice laced with disbelief. "Chloe, this isn't funny." But it wasn't funny. It was terrifying. Maya, who'd been quiet, her usual playful demeanor vanished, stepped forward, her eyes wide, reflecting the light from our headlamps. "Something took her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Liam scoffed, shaking his head, trying to cling to logic in the face of the impossible. "No, she just panicked, got lost. She's probably just around the next bend, freaking out." But even he didn't sound convinced. We called her name again and again, our voices raw, desperate, but the silence swallowed them whole. There was no reply, no answering shout, only the oppressive weight of the mine and the growing dread that settled over us like a shroud. We searched, of course. What else could we do? We split up, foolishly, calling her name, our headlamps cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing but endless tunnels, cold rock, and the growing sense of despair. Liam, still clinging to rationality, insisted she must be lost, that we just needed to find our way back to the main tunnel, retrace our steps. But the mine, it wasn't cooperating. Tunnels that seemed familiar suddenly ended in blank walls of rock. Passages we swore we'd already explored opened into new, unknown chambers. It was like the mine itself was shifting, changing, disorienting us, trapping us. "This isn't right," Maya whispered, her voice strained, her eyes darting nervously into the shadows. "Mines don't change." They didn't, but this mine did, or something within it. The whispers grew louder, closer, no longer just echoes but distinct murmurs, like voices just beyond the edge of hearing. And the feeling of being watched intensified, not just watched, but hunted. A cold, predatory gaze that seemed to bore into our very souls. It was Maya, her voice tight with a dawning horror, who finally put the pieces together. She'd been researching the local legends, the urban myths that had drawn us to Blackwood Ridge in the first place. She dismissed them, of course, laughed them off as small-town superstition. But down here in the oppressive darkness, with Chloe gone and the mine itself turning against us, the legends started to sound less like stories and more like warnings. "The mine dweller," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "That's what they called it, the old stories. They said this mine, it's not just abandoned, it's occupied." Liam scoffed again, his skepticism a desperate shield against the rising terror. "Mine dweller? Come on, Maya, that's just folklore. There's no such thing." But Maya shook her head, her voice trembling but firm. "It's not just folklore, Liam, it's older than that, they said. They said the mine, it's a place where the veil is thin between worlds and something ancient, lives here. A creature of darkness, of rock, angered by intrusion. A creature of darkness and rock." It sounded absurd, fantastical, ripped from the pages of a bad horror novel. But down here in the suffocating blackness, with the whispers growing louder and Chloe's screams still echoing in our minds, it didn't seem so absurd anymore. It felt real. Terrifyingly real. And then it started to hunt us. Not with claws or teeth, not with brute force, but with the mine itself. The tremors intensified, no longer just random rumbles but deliberate shifts in the rock, walls groaning, ceilings creaking. Tunnels that were solid moments before collapsed in thunderous roars of rock and dust, cutting off paths, trapping us deeper within the labyrinth. The whispers became voices, no longer murmurs but clear, chilling words, echoing from the rock itself, from the darkness all around us. "Leave," they hissed. "This is not yours." And then louder, closer, a voice that wasn't just a whisper but a guttural, earth-shaking growl that vibrated through our bones. "Get out." Cave-ins blocked our path back. Tunnels twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the mine, not out. It was like the mine was alive, sentient, actively working to trap us, to crush us, to feed us to its dweller. We were running now, not searching, not exploring, just running blindly through the darkness, the mine dweller's growls echoing behind us, the whispers all around us, the rock itself our enemy. Maya, her face streaked with dust and tears, stumbled, her flashlight beam jerking wildly. "The legends," they said, "sacrifice," she gasped, her breath ragged. "To appease it, you have to sacrifice something precious." Sacrifice. It sounded insane, desperate, ripped from the pages of those same bad horror novels we dismissed. But what else did we have? Logic had failed us. Reason had failed us. All that was left was the impossible, the irrational, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the legends were true. Liam, his face pale but resolute, stopped running. He reached into his pocket, his hand trembling, and pulled out a compass. Not just any compass, but an old, tarnished brass compass, his grandfather's, a family heirloom he always carried with him. "This," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "this is all I have." He held it out, his hand shaking, the compass spinning wildly in the oppressive darkness. "For Chloe," he whispered. And then, with a sob that was swallowed by the mine's darkness, he threw the compass into the black abyss of a side tunnel, a sacrifice offered to the unseen, unknowable horror that hunted us. For a moment nothing changed. The growls continued, the whispers persisted, the rock still pressed in on us. Then slowly, gradually, the tremors subsided. The whispers faded. The oppressive weight lifted, just a fraction, just enough to breathe. "Run," Maya hissed, grabbing my arm. "Now." And we ran. We ran as if the darkness itself was chasing us, fueled by adrenaline and terror, guided by Maya's frantic memory of the mine's layout, by the faint, almost imperceptible shift in the mine's malevolence. The tunnels were still treacherous, still labyrinthine, but they no longer seemed to actively try to trap us. The cave-in ceased. The paths, though winding, remained open. We stumbled, we fell, we crawled, but we kept moving, driven by the desperate hope of escape, by the fading memory of Chloe's scream, by the weight of Liam's sacrifice. And then, finally, impossibly, we saw it. A faint glimmer of light, a pale, ethereal glow that wasn't our headlamps, wasn't electric, but something else, something natural. Daylight. We burst from the mine entrance, blinking in the sudden brightness, gasping in the blessedly clean, cold mountain air. The forest was still silent, but now it was a natural silence, not the oppressive, waiting silence of the mine. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows, but it was sunlight, real sunlight, not the artificial glow of our headlamps, not the pulsing, unholy light of the mine dweller. We were out, we were alive, Liam. Liam wasn't with us. We stood there at the mouth of the mine, Maya and I, panting, shaking, our bodies battered, our minds shattered. Behind us, the mine entrance gaped like a dark, silent tomb. Ahead of us, the forest stretched out, cold, indifferent, but blessedly, beautifully empty. We left Blackwood Ridge that night, leaving Chloe and Liam and the mine dweller behind in the suffocating darkness. We never spoke of it again, not really. How could we? What words could describe the claustrophobic terror of those tunnels, the unseen horror that hunted us, the sacrifice that bought our escape? Blackwood Ridge remains a scar on my soul, a place of unending night, of whispers in the rock, of a darkness that waits, patient and ancient in the abandoned mines. I still see the darkness sometimes in my dreams in the corners of my vision, and I hear the whispers, faint, distant, but always there, reminding me of what we left behind and what we escaped. And sometimes, in the deepest, darkest silence, I can almost feel the cold, ancient breath of the mine dweller, still sleeping, still waiting in the heart of Blackwood Ridge. You ever feel like you're just tempting fate? Like you're standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing you shouldn't look down, but you can't help yourself? That's how I felt pulling into Pine Hollow campground that Friday afternoon. Pine Hollow, even the name had a certain resonance. Not the good kind. My girlfriend, Sarah, was practically vibrating with excitement in the passenger seat, her eyes wide and bright. "Kevin, it's perfect. Look at those trees." Mike, ever the boisterous one, whooped from the back. "Campfire stories tonight, boys and girls. I've been saving a good one." Jessica, pragmatic as ever, just rolled her eyes from the other back seat. "Let's just get the tent set up before it gets dark, okay, thrill seekers?" We were supposed to be relaxing, unwinding. A weekend away from the city's relentless grind, the digital leash of our jobs, the low hum of everyday anxiety. Pine Hollow, nestled on the fringes of the Blackwood National Forest, was supposed to be our sanctuary. Irony, right? Choosing a place named Pine Hollow on the edge of Blackwood for safety. It's like we were practically begging for trouble. The campground was deceptively normal. Families unpacked minivans, the scent of charcoal grills already drifting through the air. Kids shrieked with laughter chasing each other around picnic tables. It was almost jarringly ordinary, this pocket of suburban normalcy wedged against the looming, ancient wilderness. We found a decent spot, a little further from the main loop, promising a modicum of privacy. As Jessica, with her usual efficiency, started unpacking the tent, Mike immediately began gathering firewood, his energy boundless. Sarah and I, well, we mostly just admired the scenery, the late afternoon sun filtering through the towering pines, casting long, dancing shadows that already hinted at the coming night. "Campfire's going to be epic," Mike declared, returning with an armload of wood that looked suspiciously like it belonged to someone else. Jessica sighed, but a small smile played on her lips. "Just don't set the forest on fire, Mike." As dusk settled and the campground noises softened into a low murmur, Mike started his campfire. He was a showman, piling the wood just so, coaxing the flames with practiced ease. Soon, a warm glow enveloped our little clearing, pushing back the encroaching darkness. That's when Mike's eyes gleamed. the firelight reflecting in their depths like something feral. "Story time," he announced, rubbing his hands together with theatrical glee. "And I've got a doozy for you guys, local legend stuff, perfect for Pine Hollow." Sarah, always game for a scare, leaned forward, her initial excitement from the car bubbling back up. "Ooh, tell us, is it spooky?" Jessica, ever the skeptic, just raised an eyebrow. "Oh, please, Mike, not another one of your true crime podcasts." Mike grinned, undeterred. "Nah, Jess, this is better. This is Pine Hollow folklore. Ever heard of the Wendigo?" Sarah gasped, her eyes widening. The Native American legend, isn't that really dark?" "Dark as midnight in a coal mine," Mike confirmed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He leaned in closer, drawing us all into his circle of fire-lit storytelling. "See, they say way back, before this was a campground, before it was even called Pine Hollow, this was sacred land. But something went wrong, something hungry." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence of the woods amplify his words. The campfire crackled, the only sound in the sudden stillness. "Legend goes there's this entity, a spirit some say, others think it's something older. They call it the Wendigo of Pine Hollow, and it's not like those Hollywood Wendigos all antlers and teeth. This one's subtler, more insidious." He lowered his voice even further. "They say it feeds on fear. It whispers to you in the woods, makes you hear things, see things. It plays on your deepest anxieties, your darkest secrets, and once it's got you, it takes you, not just your body, but your soul." Sarah shivered dramatically, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Mike, stop it, you're creeping me out." Jessica scoffed, but even she seemed a little less dismissive. "Wendigo stories are just that, stories. They're metaphors for survival, for the dangers of the wilderness. They're not real." Mike just smirked, ignoring Jessica's pragmatic dismissal. "Oh, but this Wendigo, the Pine Hollow one, they say it's different. They say it can shapeshift, take on the form of anything you fear most. A shadow in the trees, a whisper on the wind, even someone you know." He glanced at Sarah, a playful glint in his eye. "Maybe even your boyfriend, Kevin." I laughed, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Nice try, Mike. You're not going to scare me with some old wives' tale." But even as I said the words, a faint unease prickled at the back of my neck. The way Mike told the story, the way the shadows seemed to deepen around our fire-lit circle, the sudden chill in the air that had nothing to do with the fading daylight. It all felt a little too atmospheric. The rest of the evening we tried to shake off Mike's story. We joked, we roasted marshmallows, we even played a silly card game. But the story hung in the air, an invisible presence at the edge of our awareness. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant owl hoot, seemed to carry a whisper of Mike's Wendigo. Later, tucked into our tent with Sarah, I tried to dismiss my unease. "Mike's just trying to be dramatic," I said, pulling her closer for warmth. "It's just a story, babe." Sarah snuggled against me, but her body was tense. I know, but it did feel kind of real, didn't it?" I sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's the woods, Sarah. Everything feels real out here. That's the point, right?" She didn't answer, just nestled closer, her breath soft against my neck. But I knew, in the quiet darkness of the tent, that Mike's campfire story had planted a seed of fear, a tiny tendril of dread that was already starting to take root. The first night was uneventful, thankfully, but the seed of fear had been sown, and the rising action, as Mike might dramatically call it, had begun. It started subtly, unsettling sounds, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, a growing sense of wrongness. The next morning, the campground was still deceptively normal. Families cooked breakfast over camp stoves, kids chased squirrels, the morning air filled with the scent of coffee and bacon. But for us, the normalcy felt strained. Like a thin veneer stretched over something darker, something unseen. As we ate our own breakfast instant oatmeal that tasted suspiciously like cardboard, Sarah jumped at a sudden rustling in the nearby bushes. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide and darting. Jessica, ever practical, sighed. "Probably just a squirrel, Sarah, or a bird." But Sarah remained tense, her gaze fixed on the rustling leaves. It sounded heavy, like something bigger. Mike, of course, couldn't resist adding fuel to the fire. "Maybe it's the Wendigo checking us out." He grinned, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, excitement, or something closer to genuine unease. I tried to play it cool, to be the rational, skeptical boyfriend. "Come on, Sarah, don't let Mike's story get to you. It's just the woods. There are animals out there." But even my own voice sounded hollow, unconvincing, because the rustling in the bushes hadn't sounded like a squirrel. It had sounded deliberate, heavy, and accompanied by something else, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Throughout the day, the unsettling occurrences continued. Hiking deeper into the woods, we kept hearing sounds that seemed to mimic Mike's Wendigo story. A branch snapping in the distance, that same heavy rustling in the undergrowth, and always those faint, almost inaudible whispers that seemed to follow us through the trees. Sarah, predictably, was the most affected. She was imaginative, easily spooked, and Mike's story had clearly resonated with her on a deep, almost visceral level. She jumped at every shadow, every sudden noise, her hand constantly reaching for mine, her grip tight and trembling. "Kevin," she whispered at one point, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves, Do you hear that whispering?" I listened, straining my ears. There was the wind in the trees, the distant call of a bird, the crunch of our boots on the forest floor. And yes, faintly, almost subliminally, there was something else. A low, murmuring sound like voices just beyond the edge of hearing. "It's just the wind, Sarah," I said, trying to sound reassuring, even though my own heart had started to beat a little faster. "The wind in the trees, you're just on edge." But she shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, it's not the wind, it's voices whispering my name." Jessica, to her credit, remained outwardly skeptical, but even her pragmatism started to crack under the weight of the mounting, unsettling details. She'd always been the cautious one, the planner, the detail-oriented member of our group. And it was Jessica who started noticing the anomalies. It started with tracks. Unusual tracks in the soft earth near our campsite. Too large for a deer, too narrow for a bear, too wrong for anything she could identify. They were indistinct, blurred by the fog and the fallen leaves, but she pointed them out to us, her voice tight with concern. "Look at these," she said, crouching beside a patch of muddy ground. "They're weird, almost human, but not quite." We examined the tracks, our initial skepticism slowly eroding. They were large, yes, and vaguely humanoid in shape, but the proportions were off. The stride was too long, the toes too pointed, and there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible drag mark beside each print, as if whatever made them was dragging something heavy. Then there was the silence, the unnatural silence that descended upon the woods whenever those unsettling sounds started. The birds would stop singing, the insects would stop buzzing, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was a silence that felt expectant. A silence that felt like waiting. And the wind, oh God, the wind. It started subtly, a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves, but it grew stronger, colder, carrying with it a chill that seeped into your bones, a wind that seemed to whisper secrets, to carry voices from somewhere else. Jessica noticed it too. "Did you feel that?" she asked one evening as we sat around the campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows that danced with the unnatural wind. "That wind, it feels wrong, like it's alive." And then the whispers started to ride on the wind, clearer now, more distinct almost. Words, not English, not any language we recognized, but something other. something ancient and guttural carried on the wind like a chilling song. It was Jessica, the pragmatic, skeptical Jessica, who finally voiced the unthinkable. "Guys," she said, her voice low and serious, breaking the hushed tension around the campfire, I think Mike's story, it's becoming real." A wave of cold dread washed over the campsite, extinguishing the last embers of our initial lightheartedness. We looked at each other, fear reflected in the firelight, the whispers of the wind seeming to echo Jessica's words, confirming our deepest, darkest fears. The campfire tale, the Wendigo of Pine Hollow, was no longer just a story. It was here, it was real, and it was hunting us. The climax hit like a physical blow, a wave of icy terror that swept through our campsite, extinguishing the last vestiges of our denial. The Wendigo, no longer a campfire story, no longer a shadowy whisper, no longer just unsettling sounds and strange tracks, manifested. It became real. It started subtly, as these things often do, with a shift in the air, a palpable thickening of the atmosphere, as if the very fabric of reality was fraying at the edges. The campfire, our small beacon of warmth and light in the encroaching darkness, flickered violently, the flames twisting and contorting as if battling an unseen force. Then the shadows moved, not the natural dancing shadows cast by the firelight, but something else, darker, deeper, solid shadows that detached themselves from the trees, coalescing, shifting, taking on form. At first, it was just a vague silhouette at the edge of our clearing, a darker patch of darkness against the already black woods. But it grew, solidified, the shadowy form taking on shape, becoming something. It unfolded slowly, agonizingly, like a nightmare taking physical form. Limbs too long, too thin, joints bending at impossible angles. A torso that seemed to twist and contort, defying human anatomy. A head. Oh God, the head. Not human, not animal, but something in between, a horrifying amalgamation of features, bone and fur and something else, something indescribable, something ancient and wrong. It was the Wendigo of Mike's campfire story, brought to life, summoned from the depths of our collective fear, given form by the power of our shared belief. It was Mike's story made flesh, or rather, made shadow and bone and something far worse than flesh. It stood at the edge of our clearing, silhouetted against the fog-choked woods, its form shifting, wavering, as if struggling to maintain a stable shape in our reality. But the eyes, those were fixed, solid, burning with an unnatural, hungry light that pierced through the darkness, fixing on us, on me, with a predatory intensity that made my blood run cold. It was a horrifying amalgamation of human and animal features, just as Mike had described. Too tall, too thin, limbs too long, joints bending at impossible angles. Patches of coarse, matted fur mingled with stretches of bone-white skin that seemed too tight, stretched taut over an unnatural frame. And the head, that grotesque mockery of a human skull, elongated, distorted, with eyes that burned with an unholy light. The campfire crackled again, a desperate, defiant spark against the encroaching darkness, and in that flickering light I saw it move. Not walk, not run, but flow, glide, an impossible fluidity for something of its size and shape. It moved towards us, towards our campsite, towards our fragile circle of firelight, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it was hunting us. It began to hunt us, just as the legends described, not with brute force, not with a direct physical assault, but with psychological torment, with a chilling mimicry of the Wendigo lore. It started with the whispers, louder now, clearer, no longer just indistinct murmurs but actual words, spoken in a voice that was both human and inhuman, both familiar and utterly alien. It called our names, each of us in turn, Sarah, Jessica, Mike, and then me, Kevin, my name twisted, distorted, imbued with a chilling resonance that made it sound like a curse. It whispered secrets, things we'd never told anyone, things we'd buried deep within ourselves, anxieties and fears and regrets, laid bare in that distorted, echoing voice. It preyed on Sarah's fear of the dark, whispering about the shadows in the trees, about things that lurked just beyond the firelight, about the darkness that would eventually consume us all. It tormented Jessica with doubts, whispering about her pragmatism, her skepticism, her reliance on logic, taunting her with the impossibility of rationalizing the irrational, of explaining the unexplainable. It stoked Mike's thrill-seeking nature, whispering promises of adventure, of pushing boundaries, of facing the ultimate fear, luring him closer to the darkness, to the very thing he'd summoned with his campfire story. And for me, it whispered about Maria, about the lost years, the broken promises, the hollow ache of loneliness, twisting my grief into a weapon, using my own pain against me. It whispered about my failures, my inadequacies, my deepest insecurities, amplifying them, magnifying them, making them feel overwhelming, inescapable. The whispers were just the prelude. Then came the physical assaults, mimicking the brutal physicality of the Wendigo legend, but with a terrifying psychological edge. It didn't just attack, it played with us. It stalked us through the woods, its movements swift and silent, appearing and disappearing like a phantom, always just out of sight, always just beyond the reach of our flashlights. It mimicked animal sounds, coyote howls that morphed into human screams, bird calls that twisted into that chilling, inhuman laughter. It threw stones, not randomly but deliberately, targeting us, aiming for our heads, our limbs, each impact a sharp, stinging reminder of its presence, of its power. And then the attacks became more direct. Branches snapped not by the wind but by something heavy, something deliberate, crashing through the undergrowth, always coming closer, always closing in. Thorns and vines seemed to reach out, not naturally but with malicious intent, snagging our clothes, tearing at our skin, holding us back, slowing us down, making us easier prey. It was a psychological torment, a slow, agonizing descent into madness, punctuated by sharp bursts of physical terror. The Wendigo wasn't just trying to kill us, it was trying to break us, to strip away our sanity, to leave us hollow shells, empty vessels for its fear-fueled hunger. The climax arrived not with a bang, but with a chilling, insidious whisper. As we huddled together, backs to the fire, flashlights frantically sweeping the darkness, Sarah suddenly stiffened, her eyes widening in terror, fixed on something just beyond my shoulder. "Kevin," she whispered, her voice barely audible, it's you." I whirled around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and there it was. Standing just beyond the firelight, its form shifting, wavering, taking on a new shape, a shape that made my heart stop cold. It was me, or rather a twisted, distorted mockery of me. The same height, the same build, the same. Features, but wrong, horribly wrong. My face but elongated, stretched. The skin too pale, too tight, the eyes burning with that same unholy light, the mouth stretched into a grotesque, mocking grin. It was the Wendigo taking on my form, becoming me. And in that moment I understood. It wasn't just feeding on our fear, it was feeding on our story. Mike's campfire tale had summoned it, our collective belief had given it power. And now, it was using our own identities against us, twisting our fears and anxieties into weapons. The Wendigo Kevin took a step forward, its distorted mouth opening, and that chilling, distorted voice, now mimicking my own, whispered, "Join me, Kevin, become part of the story." That was the moment of truth. The moment when I understood what we had to do, not to fight the Wendigo physically, not with weapons or strength, but to fight it psychologically, to sever its connection to our story, to deny its reality. "No," I shouted, my voice raw, desperate, cutting through the whispers of the wind, through the Wendigo's chilling mimicry. "No, you're not real, you're just a story, just a stupid campfire story." I grabbed Sarah, Jessica, Mike, pulling them close, forcing them to look at me, to look away from the horrifying image of Wendigo Kevin. "Stop it!" I yelled at them, at all of us, my voice cracking with emotion. "Stop talking about it. Stop believing it. It's just a story. We made it up. We can unmake it." It was a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to regain control, to rewrite the narrative, to deny the Wendigo the very thing it craved: our fear, our belief, our story. We huddled together, our small circle of firelight our only defense against the encroaching darkness, and we stopped talking about the Wendigo. We stopped whispering its name. We stopped feeding it our fear. Instead, we focused on the practical. We built up the fire, making it bigger, brighter, pushing back the shadows with defiant flames. We kept our flashlights trained on the darkness, creating a fragile circle of light around our campsite. We stayed united, huddled together, our physical presence a bulwark against the psychological assault. Slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the Wendigo's hold began to weaken. The whispers faded, the shadows receded, the wind softened, the air cleared. Wendigo Kevin wavered, its form flickering, distorting, losing its sharp edges, becoming less defined, less real. By dawn it was gone, vanished, unmade, leaving behind only the lingering chill in the air, the echoes of whispers in the wind, and the indelible mark of terror etched into our minds. We escaped Pine Hollow that morning, leaving behind our ravaged campsite, our abandoned gear, and the chilling memory of the campfire story that came true. We drove away in silence, each of us carrying the weight of what we'd experienced, the understanding of the dangerous power of stories, the thin, fragile veil between fiction and reality. We left the Wendigo behind, in the shadows of Pine Hollow, but we knew, with a certainty that chilled us to the bone, that we would never truly escape its grasp. Because some stories, once told, once believed, have a way of lingering, of waiting, of whispering in the darkness, forever reminding us of the thin line between what is real and what we fear might be. And sometimes, the stories we tell around a campfire have a way of becoming more real than we ever intended.